Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 201, and welcome to the first in a couple of lectures examining the next time period under review in this class, the antebellum reform era. In this lecture and in lecture next week, as we make our way towards the midterm project, we'll be examining the early 19th century, the antebellum age in American history. Antebellum is a Latin term for before the war. In this case, we're talking about before the U.S. Civil War. And so we're talking about the decades just before the Civil War in the early 19th century. And we're going to emphasize the culture of reform in this age. We'll be talking about a key moment in American history known as the antebellum reform era, where in the early 1800s there are a cluster of reform efforts. That will be our focus here. In this next time period, we're zooming ahead in American history, no longer in the colonial period, where after the American Revolution, the United States now exists as a separate sovereign nation, and we'll examine the early 19th century, the early 1800s, and how in the United States there was this great mania, this great enthusiasm for reform, a cluster, a constellation of different reform movements. In our next lecture, next week, we'll talk about such key movements as abolitionism, the effort to end slavery, feminism, the effort to create equality among the sexes. In this first lecture, though, we'll talk about the role of religion amidst a great cultural religious awakening and the way in which it, too, was part of this culture of reform. So we're beginning a brand new time period, a brand new theme, the culture of antebellum reform. We're now focusing on the early 19th century, this antebellum period in the decades before the American Civil War. And in lectures and readings, we'll be examining the culture of reform in this period as we now make our way into the second time period and theme. In this first lecture, as I said, we're going to focus on the role of religion, a major religious awakening in the culture of reform. But let's begin with some general observations about the antebellum reform period. In 1841, the noted American writer, scholar, philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson observed this age, this antebellum age, 1841, decades prior to the American Civil War, and remarked that, quote, "In the history of the world, the doctrine of reform has never such hope as the present hour." What Emerson was saying is that this moment, this present hour here in 1841, is a moment where the United States, humanity within this nation, is really enlivened and inspired by the doctrine of reform, by the idea of change. The antebellum reform period is one of four periods in American history where the nation as a whole is excited, energized by the prospects of change and reform. There's this period, the antebellum reform period. Later in American history, there's a period known as the progressive era, which we'll talk about briefly in our third time period and theme, modern American consumer culture. Then there's the New Deal period during the Great Depression, and then finally the modern civil rights movements of the post-World War II period, which we'll also talk about briefly later in the class. Those are the four moments in American history where the nation is rocked by this great enthusiasm for change. The first of those four time periods are focused here at this point in the class, the antebellum era, the period where Ralph Waldo Emerson is making this remark. Emerson was a writer, philosopher. He's one of the founders of a uniquely American philosophical school, transcendentalism, that is itself part of this era of reform. Being a writer, philosopher, professor, he was a very astute observer of America. And that's why we begin this lecture and this time period and theme with his words that testify to how Emerson, this astute observer of America, could see this doctrine of reform so powerful in America. The antebellum reform era is a period where Americans thought bravely, boldly. They sought change. It is a period that, as we'll talk about next week, would spawn a movement to end slavery, to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history, and create equality among the races, reversing all of American history up until this point. You have to think bravely and boldly to imagine such a possibility. As we'll also talk about next week, it's a period of intense feminism where women are seeking gender equality in this country. So it's a period where Americans thought bravely, boldly. It is a period where Americans were firm in the faith that we can change things, that reform is possible. That is our focus here in these lectures, the culture of reform in the antebellum period, where Americans said emphatically, the way things are is not how they have to be. We can change things. We could end slavery. We could end racism, sexism. We could create a better America. Why? Why does this happen at this moment? Well, this is a product, the antebellum reform era, the enthusiasm for reform, the firm faith that the way things are is not how they have to be. It is a product of some sweeping changes in the American economy and American society in this period, namely a shift in the economy from a rural farm-based economy to an industrial economy. In the early 1800s, in the antebellum era, in the early 19th century, northern states are awash in this dramatic shift where they are slowly but steadily shifting from a farm-based economy to an industrial economy, from an economy focused on farming to one focused on manufacturing, from one where you farm to one where you live in a city, work in a factory. Industrialization, urbanization are sweeping through northern states prior to the Civil War, and they are causal, they are influential in sparking the doctrine of reform that Emerson testified to in this period in a couple of ways. Industrialization meant now Americans were clustered together in cities. To work in a factory required that sort of concentration of production and labor. Factories often had to be located in fixed positions near rivers to fire up the steam turbines that were necessary to power these machines involved in mass producing goods. So it was a concentration of labor, a concentration of a population. And that meant you had now people clustered together. And as a result, good ideas as well as goods could circulate in ways never seen before. With industrialization came urbanization, came the rise of cities in northern states in the early 1800s, and cities were incubators for new ideas that could, in fact, influence a sizable population now concentrated. Furthermore, cities created problems, poverty, inequities, and wealth that were keenly and sharply in focus. So there was this grave understanding that problems exist. But there was also a context by which ideas could develop, circulate, and influence that convinced Americans that those problems could be solved. Again, the way things are is not how they have to be. In moments of reform, and again there are 4 in our history, there has to be both a sense of discontent. You don't spark reform movements if everyone's happy. But you also have to have a belief that those problems, those ills in society can be remedied. Right now in America, in 2020, I think there's widespread agreement across political spectrums around the nation that there are deep-rooted problems in this nation. There's discontent in this country right now. You don't have to work too hard to see that. But we are not, right now in 2020, experiencing the 5th moment of reform because we don't have the other necessary ingredient, that firm faith that these problems can be solved. In fact, we probably have the opposite sense in America today. There's a sense that some problems can't be solved because of divisions in the country, because of incompetence, because of a political or economic system that just doesn't seem to work anymore. In order to have faith in reform, you have to have faith in change. And you had that, in part because of industrialization, urbanization, and the way in which they generated problems. People clustered in cities felt that their lives were difficult, desperate. They were often paid very little as they worked in factories. There was this great clamor for change. But there was also, with it, a faith that that change was possible. And we'll talk about why that is so in this lecture, in particular that focuses on religion. And then once that confidence, once that sensibility that change was possible develops, it spread like wildfire in these concentrated urban areas where for the first time in American history, people find themselves living in cities, find themselves living in cities where people are concentrated in a way that allows ideas to circulate in ways never seen before. Also important in this, new forms of communication and transportation that allows ideas to circulate across the whole of the nation. Not only is this an age of cities and factories, but it's also an era of railroads and eventually in the 1840s telegraphs that bind together the nation in new ways and allow ideas to circulate across the whole of the nation. New forms of communication, new forms of transportation, and forms of communication and transportation that are modern marvels. One interesting element of American history in this period is the dramatic technological change. One generation of Americans who come of age in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s live through convulsive change, all of which transpires in just one generation. One generation of Americans would live to see the onset of railroads, steamboats, the steam press, factories, sewing machines, typewriters. All of this is invented between 1820 and 1845. You know, today we have the sense that we live in such a technologically advanced age as we all walk around with our smartphones and yell into our smart speakers. You know, for such a dumb society, we sure insist on naming everything smart, right? The other day I saw a guy in a smart car talking on a smartphone, drinking smart water. He looks so stupid, you know. So today we like to congratulate ourselves. Oh, we live in such a technologically advanced age because I guess we can download and watch cat videos whenever we want. But you can make a much better case that in this era of the early 19th century, the antebellum age, Americans lived in the most dramatic period of technological change, where you get railroads and steamboats and the steam press, mass producing printed words in a way that was never possible. And we'll talk about that importance to the abolitionist movement next week. There are all these technologies, all of these forms of transportation, communication that allow us to think broadly, think nationally, make larger movements possible, movements that could change society, change the nation. That too is causal. That too helps us explain why Emerson observed what he did in 1841. And so we have these factors in the economy and society and technology, broad changes that help us understand as historians and history students why it is this period that the nation is so active and alive in the prospects of change, why this period would spawn efforts to end slavery, end patriarchy, create a new America, reborn, resurrected. The way things are is not how they have to be. So that might testify to the zeal and passion for reform and change, but it leaves out the nature of change. How to make things better? Well, that's a different question, isn't it? We might believe in the possibility of change, and we might believe in the necessity of change. There are problems that need to be solved, and we could solve them, but what about how to solve them? Now, as we'll see in these two lectures, there are a wide range of answers to that last question, a wide range of answers to the question of how to reform, how to change. Many of the movements we'll talk about here in these two lectures are very forward-looking. They're ambitious. They're very progressive in vision, seeking dramatic change, like ending slavery, like creating racial and gender equality in America. But many of the other movements, particularly ones we'll talk about at the end of this lecture, look backward and try to reverse the trends of the present and future and go back to a more rural, agrarian society, or cut themselves off of these modern trends in an increasingly urban industrial America. Some American reformers look backward and try to hold on to an America that was slipping away, seeing that as progress and reform, cutting themselves off from new changes that were often seen as noxious, corrosive, not good, not positive. But other Americans in this period thought in a forward way and embraced change. Whether you look backward or forward, whether you saw the new America as a positive one or a negative one, Americans in this period are eager for change, making it the era of antebellum reform. Okay, so that establishes the context by which the antebellum reform period develops. Let's now focus on those different forms of reform. And in this first lecture examining the antebellum reform period, we're going to emphasize the role of religion in reform. And we'll talk about how religion often served as a catalyst to reform movements, often inspiring the abolitionist and feminist movements, but also how religion itself was a form of reform. In the previous slide, we talked about industrialization, urbanization, new forms of transportation and communication that help us as historians and history students understand why this is a period of great excitement for reform. But another factor, another contextual factor, another thing going on in America in this very important, consequential, and complex time was a major religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening is one of 4 moments of great religious excitement in America. There are 4 moments in our history where the nation as a whole is rocked by great enthusiasm for religion, religiosity, commitment to God. The first is the First Great Awakening, which takes place in the colonial period in the decades prior to the American Revolution. Then there's the Second Great Awakening, which is our focus here. Later in American history, in the 1920s, there would also be a massive religious revival after the upheavals of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, after the Progressive Era, after the miseries, horrors of World War I, and after a massive pandemic would kill many Americans. In the 1920s, following those events, there was another major religious revival, the third moment of great religious excitement. And then in the 1970s, also after a period of dramatic change in the 1960s, you'd have the fourth moment of religious excitement with the rise of the born-again movement, evangelicals, cultural conservatives, the religious right. So there are these 4 moments in American history where the nation as a whole is rocked by great passion and excitement for religion. Second of which is the Second Great Awakening, which occurs here in the antebellum period. And the Second Great Awakening would be a catalyst to reform and itself a form of reform because it was predicated on 2 core assertions. The first core assertion of the Second Great Awakening is the idea that God is knowable. God is not a mystery. God is not opaque. God is knowable, meaning that every individual can know God. Every individual can know God simply by opening your heart to God. You don't need to master biblical languages like Hebrew or Aramaic. You don't have to immerse yourself in biblical scholarship. You don't have to graduate from a university. All you have to do is open your heart to God, and he will reveal himself. God is knowable. Second core assertion of the Second Great Awakening, free will. Once you know what God demands, because again, God is knowable, well, it's up to you to choose, using your free will, either to do the righteous, godly, moral thing, or to sin. If you choose to do the godly, righteous, moral thing, you will be rewarded with a better life here on earth and salvation in the next life. You'll go to heaven. Or if you choose to sin, you'll be punished with a miserable life here on earth and hell and damnation in the afterlife. So it's up to you. Free will. Choose to do the godly, righteous thing. You'll have a better life here on earth and you'll spend eternity in heaven. Or you could be like your professor and always do the wrong thing, sin, 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 and be punished with a miserable life here and hell and damnation in the next life. Look, I know where I'm going when I die, and if you die and wake up, I'm there. Guess what? You're in hell too. Ha ha ha, I'll torture you forever with these lectures, right? That's the calculus in the Second Great Awakening. That's the idea of free will. What this meant was people felt as if they had power over their lives. What this meant was people felt as if they were agents of their lives, that they could make choices and have self-determination. So the Second Great Awakening, this massive religious revival in this antebellum period, told Americans, you can know God. God has a message for you. You matter as an individual, and as an individual, you have free will. And that's the way in which this massive religious revival is such a catalyst to reform and itself an idea of reform. So the Second Great Awakening is this massive religious revival. It sweeps across the nation. In the 1820s and 1830s, it speaks to people who are living in these times of dramatic change. It was strongest in areas where people were struggling to adapt to a new America of industrialization, urbanization. I mentioned that cities often spawn problems, made problems magnified. Cities also allowed ideas to circulate, but also cities and urbanization and industrialization were important in developing the antebellum reform era because this transition was very abrupt and unsettling to many Americans whose parents and grandparents had been farmers, and now they find themselves living in cities, working in factories, selling their time for money in a new system of wage labor. That was very anxiety-inducing. That was very unsettling to be swept up in major changes, such abrupt and dramatic changes in this larger period of dramatic change. And it is there in those cities where people often felt unmoored, anxious, unsettled by these dramatic changes that the Second Great Awakening had its greatest impact in urban areas or areas that were subject to influxes of people pushed off the land into cities, immigrants pouring in, migrant magnets. People who were swept up in these broad trends of urbanization, industrialization, often felt unsettled, anxious. And the Second Great Awakening spoke to those people because it said, you matter. God has a message for you, and you have free will. You have power over your life. Second Great Awakening had a very appealing message that was reformist in its expression. It said, you have power. You can be an agent of your own making. Second Great Awakening also was a very open expression of religiosity. Preachers traveled the country and inspired crowds of people. People who had their lives transformed told their neighbors and co-workers in a concentrated urban setting where ideas could spread, infect, and influence in the new urban America. Religiosity in America is often very outward and expressive. Go to an American church, people are standing up, they're singing. Well, they used to when they could gather in that way, shake hands and hug each other. Americans don't express their religion in a quiet way, in a contemplative way. It's very outward and expressive and passionate, involving singing. Americans go around telling others about their conversion or their commitment to God. They put a bumper sticker on their car. They knock on your door Saturday morning when you're hungover. Americans are very expressive, and that was certainly true in this period in regards to religiosity, and that meant it was passionate, it was persuasive, and it could spread and be this large reaching event that could inspire such a religious awakening and the ethos of reform that was at its center. Again, the Second Great Awakening argued anyone can know God. It was a democratization of God. It touched Americans from a variety of walks of life. It was democratic in that sense. In this age, there are changes in voting participation, the 1820s, 1830s, that end the property owning requirement to vote. Prior to the 1820s and 1830s, to vote in America, you had to be a white male property owner. The franchise, the right to vote, was restricted not just based on race and gender, but also based on wealth. But that ends in the 1820s and 1830s so that all white men can vote. Who still can't vote? Women and people of color. But that meant that hundreds of thousands of people who previously couldn't vote because they didn't own property now could vote. And that's why some people see this as a more democratic age. It isn't, because again, so many people could not vote, women, people of color. But it is an age of universal white manhood suffrage. But what's even more democratic in this period is the Second Great Awakening, even far-reaching, even more transformative, because it did not discriminate based on race and gender. The only people who could vote in America in the 1830s are white men. But the Second Great Awakening, with its core assertions that all could know God, touched people of color. Slaves in the South in this period were deeply touched by this religiosity. It often inspired rebellion, running away. You certainly see that in the book you're reading for this portion of the class, the narrative of Frederick Douglass, a man who ran away from slavery in the transformed American history who was deeply inspired by his religiosity. You see that in the rebellion of Nat Turner in 1831, himself deeply connected to God, seeing himself as a prophet of God. The Second Great Awakening reached women of color and white women. So this was a mass democratic expression in an age that America isn't democratic in terms of political power, far-reaching, inspiring, and what was at its core was this idea of self-determination, that you have the power, you have free will to determine not only your fate here on earth, but most importantly, the afterlife, where you will spend eternity. The Second Great Awakening, with these core assertions of a knowable God and free will, was itself a form of reform, because it empowered people to imagine themselves as agents of change, even in an era where so many of them were denied political participation. The core assertions of the Second Great Awakening: self-determination. You can know God and you have free will. What this said to Americans who often felt they had no power, who were swept up by these trends in the economy and society of industrialization, urbanization, was you do have the power. You do have free will. The winds of change may be blowing with or without your consent. A new America, often disorienting, unsettling, may be germinating, one of technological change, industrialization, urbanization. But despite the fact that you feel as if these winds of change blow without your consent or input, you still do have power over your own life. That was the appealing message here of the Second Great Awakening. That's how it was a key part of this era of reform. Key figure in the Second Great Awakening is this man, Charles Grandison Finney, who was an itinerant preacher who traveled the country. He traveled the country on its new network of roads, its new forms of transportation like steamboats and later railroads that allowed him to crisscross the nation, making him arguably the very first national celebrity in America in an age well before the means of celebrity today: radio, television, cinema, and now the internet. Today, if you want to be a celebrity, open Shopkins on YouTube. But they didn't have YouTube in the 1840s, and yet Finney would be reasonably known by Americans north, south, east, and west. He's probably the only American of this age who would be known across the whole of the nation other than the presidents of this age. He traveled the country. He had his greatest success in areas of tumult and change like New York City, the American city in an age of urbanization, but also in upstate New York. Upstate New York in an area around the Erie Canal, which opened in 1815 and brought dramatic change to that region of the country. The Erie Canal connected New York City to the interior, to the Great Lakes region. It was a mechanism for allowing commerce to flow across a nation in a new era of the transportation revolution. It spawned cities along its way. It was a dramatic change that seemed to indicate the power of human beings over nature, where we could blow up mountains and divert rivers. And so the Erie Canal was at the heart of these changes that for many were unsettling, unnerving. A new age of dramatic technological change, economic change. And Finney tapped into that anxiety and woe in upstate New York, in New York City, demonstrative of the point I've made earlier, that the Second Great Awakening was strongest in such areas of change. Finney had a passionate style. He would take to the pulpit without any notes, speaking seemingly from his heart, indicating he knew God, that God was within him, as part of the overall message of the Second Great Awakening, that anyone could know God. He employed music in a couple of ways to capture people's attention. He would march through the streets of a city with his Holy Roller Band and capture the attention of people, drawing them to the tent he had erected on the outskirts of town where he would give his message. So like a Pied Piper, the Holy Roller Band would capture the interest of Americans. Now, it's the 1840s, and that meant that music was rare. It's not like today where music is so available on demand, where we all walk around with these earbuds in our ear constantly listening to music. In this period, music is literally in the air, fleeting, going away. In this era, if you want music, you better whip out your own banjo and fiddle and have at it. So if you hear music, take notice, and you might be drawn to that tent on the outskirts of the city. But when you arrived in that tent, Finney continued to encourage people to dance as the Holy Roller Band played music. And he did so because he argued you're more primed, you're more ready to receive God, to have that awakening where God speaks to you if you're moving and grooving, if you're shaking your ass. He encouraged people to dance because he said, when you're dancing, you're not thinking. When you're dancing, you lose your cares and inhibitions, and you just feel. And that makes you primed and ready to receive God. So not only did he draw people in with music, he encouraged people to dance. Now, inevitably, when people were grooving and moving to the Holy Roller Band, one of them would start shaking and convulsing. Finney would bring them up to the pulpit in what he called an altar call, where these people were convulsing and shaking. And Finney claimed that at that moment God was speaking to them, that God was revealing something to them. Now, if you see your neighbor, your coworker, your spouse convulsing and shaking, where you're convinced that God is speaking to them, well, you get envious. You want God to speak to you too. And then, of course, as a result, all the people in attendance would start shaking and quaking and quivering, convinced that God had spoken to them. Eventually, Finney would take to the pulpit and give his sermon. And at the core of his sermon was that idea of a knowable God, a God you are accountable to, and that appealing message of free will that did appeal to Americans who often felt they had no control over their lives in an age where they're being pushed off the farm into cities, selling their time for money, living in urban areas. Finney said you do have power, and that's the reformist element of his message and the Second Great Awakening. Further evidence of the way in which the Second Great Awakening served as a catalyst to reform and how it was itself a way of thinking about reform and change is the way in which it spawned a brand new doctrine, the doctrine of perfectionism that ran counter to centuries of Christian thinking and theology. Christian thinking and theology had been rooted in the doctrine instead of original sin, the idea that you're born a sinner and will live your life as a sinner, and your only hope is to pray to God for mercy. This was well established in Christian thinking theology, certainly throughout Europe and here in the United States. It goes back to the story of Adam and Eve, how God created paradise, where Adam and Eve, the first human beings, didn't have to work because whatever they wanted was right there at their fingertips. They could just pluck from any tree and have whatever they needed. However, there was one rule. Don't eat from that tree, the tree of knowledge. Well, what did Adam and Eve do? They bit the apple, they sinned, and were exiled from the Garden of Eden. And the doctrine of original sin posits that all subsequent human beings, all people born to those first two humans, inherited that original sin. So you're born a sinner, and you'll live your life as a sinner. You'll die as a sinner. And the only hope for you is to fear God, pray to God, pray for God's mercy. That's the doctrine of original sin. But in the Second Great Awakening, it was challenged by the doctrine of perfectionism that argued actually people could become free of sin. They could become morally perfect. This is rooted in the two core assertions of the Second Great Awakening. God is knowable and free will. If God is knowable, you know exactly what God wants, and you have free will, isn't it possible, therefore, to use your free will to live strictly according to what God demands and therefore become morally perfect? So the Second Great Awakening so inspired people to believe they had the power to change themselves, to have command over their lives and their salvation, that it inspired Americans to believe they could become morally perfect in defiance of that idea of original sin. And once they became convinced that they were capable of moral perfection, once they became convinced that they were free of sin, once they became convinced that they were, therefore, moral exemplars, walking, talking, breathing examples of how to live according to God, they went on crusades to wipe out the sin of society. And that's what led to the various reform movements in this period, to not only end slavery, advance the cause of gender equality, but to stamp out war, prostitution. This was an age of a temperance movement, which sought to persuade people to give up alcohol. This is a period in American history that for the first time would see alcohol as sinful. Prior to the 1820s, 1830s, consumption of alcohol was not considered a moral failing or a sin. But in this period, for the first time, it was seen as something sinful, evil alcohol, and that's what led to a temperance movement that was designed to persuade people to give up evil alcohol. Temperance movement came out of this doctrine of perfectionism, where Americans imagine that they could indeed become morally perfect and transform not just themselves, but society. So the Second Great Awakening in so many ways is this reformist movement rooted in these ideas of a noble God and free will that allowed people to imagine that they were in charge of their lives, in charge of salvation, and also capable of ending the evil that surrounded them, making this such a moment of ambitious reform efforts, this antebellum reform age. And it even inspired people to believe they could create a perfect world. There are hundreds of such utopian societies in this antebellum period. People who came together and believed that they could create a perfect world here on earth because of this notion of perfectionism or a noble God, free will. Here is more concrete evidence of the Second Great Awakening as a form of reform. The utopian societies that developed in this period that were dedicated to making a perfect world here on earth, where people believed they could do this, that they could create here on earth a perfect society. Utopia is a word in the English language that describes this idea of a perfect world. It was first coined by the novelist Thomas More and continues to be used as an expression for the possibility of a perfect world. And in this period, many Americans embarked on such efforts and created these utopian societies. And in a moment, we'll describe two very specific utopian societies, but there were many examples of this effort in this period where people believed that the way things are is not how they have to be, that we could even create here on earth a perfect society. They're often founded by charismatic individuals who themselves believed that they had this power, that they knew what God demanded and could create perfect societies here on earth. And they reached out to people and convinced them to join with them in creating these societies, these communities, that, as we'll describe in a moment, were often very antithetical to broader contours in society. They often sought to separate, divorce themselves from the dominant ways of being. They're often created in frontier areas far away from the large population centers. They often oriented their societies in a very unorthodox way, living in an unorthodox fashion, contrary to the broader contours in America in this period. They're often very communal in their orientation, rooted in a notion of equality that was elusive in an age that was very unequal. They're often dedicated to equality among the races and genders, but also in terms of materialism, living simply, austerely, but also sharing in a way that defied the profit motive so active and alive in this era of industrialization and wage labor. Now, as a result of these elements, sometimes these utopian societies are described as cults, where there's this one charismatic leader and he has this command over the members of his group. But the term cult is often one that comes with negative connotations. It's often a pejorative. And it's not, therefore, a good way of describing these utopian societies. Because though they were founded by charismatic leaders, the people who joined these movements weren't mindless sheep. They were people who made a willful decision. They chose to live in this fashion. They chose to often reject dominant society and culture. They said, I want this. And it often allowed them a measure of equality and opportunity that they would have never achieved in dominant society, in mainstream society. So we should not see the people who join these communities as victims of some Svengali-like figure. We should not see them as mindless sheep. We should not use the term cult that, again, tends to be freighted with such connotations. Instead, what we see here is this individualism that's at the heart of the Second Great Awakening, where individuals become convinced that they can know God, where individuals become convinced that they can create perfect worlds here on earth, where individuals believe they have this power to make choices and decisions, choices that often involve rejecting the dominant society and creating something unique, something satisfying that they imagine exists as a perfect world. So these utopian societies are very demonstrative of certainly the Second Great Awakening, but moreover, the Second Great Awakening as part of this culture of reform, where people imagine they could create these perfect worlds here on earth. Many of these communities emphasized equality of the races, equality of the genders, and as I've said many times, this is a very unequal age in America. But also, many of these communities embraced austerity, simple life, rejecting materialism, the profit motive. Many of these communities emphasize sharing. And so they are very countercultural in that way. They're very countercultural in the way in which they reject this new age of a market revolution, industrialization, urbanization, where there's this great emphasis on rising from rags to riches. There's this great emphasis on materialism. Instead, these communities, unorthodox, strange, we might see, were ways of creating something that was separate from those elements of American life in an age of industrialization, in an age of dramatic change, granting people this power to carve out something that was of their own making. These societies, in being more democratic, these societies that often emphasized equality among the races or genders, make them arguably the most democratic in an age that again was hardly democratic. So rather than see them as cults, rather than see them as a means by which one individual could exert great power over the many, we should see them as people making willful choices, believing in this doctrine of self-determination, free will, and seeking to create what they imagined was a perfect world here on earth, certainly very emblematic of this fervor and excitement for reform in the antebellum age. Let's now talk about two examples of these reform movements, the first of which was formed by a woman, Mother Ann Lee. Mother Ann Lee claimed to have a religious awakening, claimed to see in her vision of God a perfect world that she could create. So her story is very demonstrative of the potential that these utopian societies had and the Second Great Awakening had for empowering individuals. Mother Ann Lee couldn't vote. Mother Ann Lee couldn't own property. Women were denied private property rights in this period, but Mother Ann Lee believed she had power over her life. She believed she knew God, and she believed she could create a perfect world here on earth. And she established a community that by the 1840s would number over 5,000. Eventually, this group that endured a great deal of persecution found a permanent place in what is modern-day Iowa. Iowa wasn't yet part of the United States as a state. It was part of a western frontier in an age that we've talked about in previous lectures, was one of westward expansion. And there in what is now Iowa, this community would blossom and develop in numbers over 5,000. This community, that for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, became known as the Shakers, emphasized the equality of the sexes. In this community, men and women lived separately, but were seen as equals in the eyes of God. This community was rather unorthodox, not only in its emphasis on the equality of men and women, but also in the way in which it rejected private property, sharing communally. Nothing belonged to one individual. Everything was shared by everyone. And the way in which they ended traditional family life as it was practiced in America by segregating the sexes, keeping men and women separate. The idea here was that traditional family life, women as mothers and men as husbands, means that you have less time for what should be your true pursuit here on earth, service of God, The emphasis in the Shaker community was on knowing God, contemplating God, and serving God. And Mother and Lee argued that as a wife and a mother, as a father and a husband, you dedicate your life to those roles rather than pursuing God. And instead, as part of a good and noble life, you should pursue God. And so they lived in a very unorthodox fashion, severing traditional family bonds and segregating the sexes. They lived a very simple life, an austere life. They farmed just enough crops that they needed to sustain themselves rather than growing more crops to sell for cash. They produced furniture, which ironically today is very valuable, to buy the things that they couldn't produce themselves, grow on their farm. So their life wasn't dedicated to materialism and profit. It was dedicated to maximizing service of God, maximizing contemplation of God. Farm just what you need to sustain yourself. Make furniture and sell it for what you can't grow yourself. Related to this very austere lifestyle was the code of abstinence that this community adhered to. Not only were the sexes segregated, not only was traditional family life ended, but the members of this community were expected to be sexually abstinent. Because again, sex, pursuit of sex, again, reproduction, life as a father or mother distracted you from what should be your true pursuit. This code of abstinence was again related to what the Shakers were committed to, why their society, they imagined, was a perfect society, because it was a society dedicated solely to serving God. Now, if everyone's abstinent, well, there's a little bit of a problem here. Where do they get more Shakers, right? And this is why there aren't any Shakers around today. If nobody is having sex, well, nobody's getting pregnant, and you have a hard time continuing your community. Well, the Shakers addressed that obvious problem, one, through adoption. They adopted orphans. They adopted children who had no parents to keep their movement going. They also sought to encourage people to constantly join their movement, converting people to their community. So they addressed the obvious problem of mandatory celibacy through this process of adopting children into their movement, thereby sustaining their movement, or converting people to their movement, helping it grow in that fashion. Well, the conversion process worked pretty good for a while. I mean, they got 5,000 people to join them and live in this rather unorthodox fashion in Iowa, but eventually they ran into a bit of a problem because not everybody wanted to live in this way, and this issue of mandatory celibacy in particular wasn't very appealing. If one of your recruiting messages is come with us and never come again, well, not everybody's going to be on board with that, right? And so this explains why the Shakers aren't around today. Eventually, they die out because they're not reproducing. The image we have here is a lithograph of the Shakers. People were fascinated by this group. They were fascinated by these people who lived in such a strange and unorthodox way. And so reporters would go out to Iowa and write about them so that people could read about them. And they produced these stories and they produced these illustrations, which is very helpful to us because, one, you see the segregation of the sexes. Women on the left, men on the right, all part of the ethos of the Shaker community, that they were to forego family life, forego dedicating their lives to being wives, mothers, fathers, husbands, and instead worship God. But also you see among the men, there are African Americans represented. The Shakers were very egalitarian. And many African Americans who lived in a very unequal society, free blacks in the North, went to live in the Shakers because it offered them not only a chance to celebrate God, to dedicate themselves to the worship of God, but greater equality than they could achieve in mainstream society. This lithograph is also helpful because here we see why they were known as the Shakers. In order to enforce mandatory celibacy, to make it possible, Mother Ann Lee, as part of their religious ritual, as you can see here in their church, would order the members of her community to stand up and shake and convulse in the hopes of shaking out all their horny energy so they wouldn't be tempted to do it. So they're known as the Shakers because they performed this ritual where they would convulse and shake in this fashion in an effort to make sure it was possible for them to not get horny and transgress the mandatory celibacy, so they could shake out all their horny energy. So that's why they became known as the Shakers, the first of these two groups that created these utopian societies. Now, this may not be your idea of a perfect world, but it demonstrates how Americans, thousands of them, embraced this way of living, and for them it was a perfect world that offered them, again, a different way of living, rejecting the materialism of this age, living in this different but fashion that allowed them some modicum of equality. So it's very demonstrative, not just of utopian societies and religion, but this faith that we can make any world we want. That mantra at the heart of antebellum reform. Second and last utopian society we'll talk about was founded by John Humphrey Noyes, who was one of many Americans in this period who went to go see Charles Grandison Finney give his sermon. And Noyes there claimed that he had an awakening, as so many did, as his body shook and convulsed. And he claimed that he had an awakening, that he got this vision from God, and as a result was going to create a perfect world, which was originally founded, this first iteration of the Utopian Society founded by John Humphrey Noyes in Putney, Vermont. This community, which will later move to Oneida, New York, and better be known as Oneida, was first founded in Putney, Vermont by John Humphrey Noyes as a community that Noyes believed would live strictly according to God. God revealed to him in that awakening that Noyes had there in that meeting, in that religious revival led by Charles Finney. So John Humphrey Noyes always posited that his community was the perfect expression of God's will, because he was living strictly according to what God demanded, revealed in that awakening. So there are all these elements here. The Second Great Awakening. God is knowable, you have free will. Finney therefore believed that they were living a morally perfect life. They were perfectionists, in line with that doctrine of perfectionism we talked about earlier. Furthermore, they believed that the end of the world was coming. They believed in millennial day, a day prophesied in the book of Revelation that marks the end of the world. And they wanted to be ready for that final judgment of God, where they would be judged as morally perfect and welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. So Noyes and his group believe the end is near, God is coming, and you better get ready for his judgment. And so they wanted to create a perfect community that would be judged by God as morally perfect and spend the rest of eternity in heaven after the earth was destroyed. So they were millennialists. They were people who prophesied the end of the world, which, just as an aside, as a tip for you, isn't really a good pursuit, a good career choice, right? I know you might be graduating soon and wondering, what are you going to do for a career? Well, don't choose prophet of doom as your career choice, because everyone in human history who has thought of themselves in that way has so far been wrong, right? Because at least for now, I don't know, the prospects aren't good for the future, but at least for now, we're all still here, right? So everyone who has thought they could predict the end of the world so far has been wrong, and that's certainly the case for John Humphrey Noyes, but he believed that he did know the end was near, and he wanted to create this perfect community. Well, what was that perfect community? In Oneida, they too rejected traditional family life, and instead embraced complex marriage. What's complex marriage? Well, you might say that's redundant, because every marriage is complex. Well, not complex in that way, like complicated. Complex marriage is the idea that everyone is married to everyone else. Complex marriage is a rejection of monogamy. It is a form of marriage where everyone is married to everyone else. The reason for this, Noyes argued, is traditional marriage, monogamy, is inherently selfish. It's all about taking someone as your individual spouse. Noyes argued, and again he always said this came from God, not from me, it came from God, that traditional marriage is inherently selfish, covetous, because it's all about exerting selfish control over one individual and one body. He said that's what marriage is all about. You stand up there in front of your friends and family and say, this one's mine, hands off, right? If you think about the language of the marriage ceremony, it crackles with notions of covetedness and possessiveness. You stand up there in front of a minister, a priest, a rabbi, an Elvis impersonator, and you say, I'm going to take this person to have and to hold. Well, Noyes said that's not how God wants us to live. God wants us to share. God doesn't want us to be covetous and possessive. And so, when you arrived in Oneida, you had to dissolve a traditional marriage, monogamy, and live in this fashion. Monogamy was banned. Everyone was married to everyone else. And this was a test of your faith, whether or not you were willing to share your body with other members of the community. Noyes argued that sex, the sexual act itself, is a religious ritual. It is where you prove your willingness to share. It is where you live according to what Noyes argued is the demand of God, to not be selfish, not be covetous, but to share. So when you arrived in Oneida, you were expected to go through this initiation rite where you were to share your body. If someone tapped you on the shoulder and said, let's share. If you said, no, I don't want to do it with you. You're ugly. You got zits on your ass. You got a little pecker. I'm not going to do it with you. Well, you'd be kicked out of the community because you were being selfish. You weren't being willing to share your body. Instead, when someone taps you on the shoulder and says, let's share, even if they're ugly, even if you don't want to do it with them, you do it because, Noyes argued, this was your initiation rite. This was your religious ceremony. You were proving that you wanted to share your body. Well, this got Noyes and this group into a little bit of trouble. In 1848, he was arrested for various charges of immorality and turpitude. And then once released, he had to flee and move his community to Oneida, New York, where he revived it. And that's why it's better known as Oneida. Oneida, New York was in upstate New York in an area of great religious excitement known as the Burned Over District, where Charles Finney had a great impact. It's also where the LDS church movement would be created by Joseph Smith, who claimed to be visited by an angel, and where he translated these tablets that became the Book of Mormon. So upstate New York, places like Oneida, were really hotbeds of religious excitement, and that's where Noyes established his community. They produced flatware, cups and saucers that they sold to sustain their movement, and the company Oneida lives on as a joint stock company to this day. If you have some decent flatware in your house, you might have some Oneida in your cupboards right now. If you've got some decent stuff, you're not like me who buys all this crap at the 99-cent store. You might have some Oneida saucers and plates in your house right now. Next time you make dinner, before you put your Hot Pockets or whatever disaster you're going to eat on your plate, flip it over. You might find that right now you have some Oneida. Company downplays its origins here, but it lives on in that fashion. Here is a picture of John Humphrey Noyes, and you could decide for yourself whether or not you wanted this guy tapping you on the shoulder and saying, let's share. I don't know, he's got this hipster thing that's kind of popular now with his beard and the like. But here is a picture of John Humphrey Noyes soon after his release, and when he established the second iteration of his community in Oneida. Again, this might not be your idea of a perfect world, but what Oneida does demonstrate is that in this period, Americans were thus inspired to create perfect worlds, or what they imagined perfect worlds here on earth, believing they were doing strictly what God demanded, living in often strange and unorthodox ways. These utopian societies, like the success and popularity of Charles Finney, like the Second Great Awakening, very revealing of this culture of reform in the antebellum era. So let's review what we've learned here in this first lecture about the role of religion and reform, the individualism that was at the heart of the Second Great Awakening, where individuals believed they could know God, they had free will, where people believed they had power of their lives even as they lived in an America that was radically changing. It was an outgrowth of a new age of the market revolution, the transportation revolution, a new age of cities and factories and wage labor, where people often felt they had no power, where there were acute problems in an age where people often felt impoverished, where people felt they had little control. Here was this message that said you do have control. It emphasized a mass movement and was arguably more democratic than the political changes of the spirit, while also emphasizing individualism with its message of a knowable God, free will, allowing people to imagine themselves as individuals in charge of their life, able to become morally perfect. And launching crusades against what they saw as the sins of society, launching efforts to create what they imagined to be perfect worlds here on earth. So we've emphasized the role of religion. Hopefully you can understand religion itself as an empowering message of reform. And in particular, we emphasize that individualism that is at the heart of so much of antebellum reform, the Second Great Awakening, and American culture in this period. In our next lecture, we'll turn our attention to movements of groups that sought to change not just individuals, but the whole of America, end slavery, create racial equality, advance the equality of women, abolitionism, and feminism, also key elements of this era of antebellum reform.